So, in Great Britain Monday and Tuesday, we received a catastrophic weather warning from the Met Office. It was the country's first red weather warning. We saw temperatures of 40.3 degrees Celsius in certain places, and apparently that was going to signal the end of the world according to climate change. How did you survive?
I just had the fan on me all day, every day.
Yeah, didn't you have some wine and fall asleep?
I did.
Oh, proper Christian wedding. Unfortunately, that lasted all of 2 days. So we have survived the climate catastrophe. 2050 deadline doesn't need to exist anymore, and you'll be seeing that little climate change Wikipedia disclaimer underneath the YouTube version of this podcast, of course. Now, despite being told not to conflate weather with climate, after everyone points to snowstorms as evidence that global warming isn't going to incinerate us all, the media did the irresponsible thing and, of course, conflated the two. And as we can see here from a post from James Melville, something incredibly instructive as to how the media decided to present weather in the last couple of years versus the current weather forecast. You can just skip to the next link, John. So, a couple of years ago, lovely and sunny, heat wave, enjoy the beach, and then, as of this year, apparently we're in the seventh circle of hell, only the deepest red possible, and most of the time the actual temperatures aren't even comparable to, I mean, as you can see on the edge of the country in Wales, it's at least a degree higher in the former forecast, but of course the climate catastrophizing will not go amiss. So, Alok Sharma, MP, didn't stop him from getting up in... Kent Online are, of course, going to whine about us using an ad blocker. Didn't stop him from getting up in Parliament, complaining about the fact that the climate crisis is going to kill us all. He says the weather is a wake-up call to the UK to address climate change. Says that many millions of people across the world are experiencing this on a regular basis, and finally the UK understands just how much they're suffering. He used that exact line in the recent release of the IPCC's paper in 2021, so it seems that he keeps calling for wake-up calls. But also Alok Sharma doesn't seem to be getting much done, because at COP26 he decided to break down in tears because his COP26 deal got watered down, mainly because China and Brazil decided they didn't want to implode their national economies at the expense of the planet. Alok Sharma also promises to resign if the next PM scraps the net zero pledge. We can only hope. This is what your favourite Kemi Badenoch actually turned around and said that if it was going to bankrupt the country, I might reconsider it, especially considering all the people setting the targets won't be around to see it come to fruition.
Well, I think that's a very conservative thing to say, obviously, speaking as a conservative. The fact that one thing she said repeatedly is we shouldn't burden the next generation with our problems. And granted, on the issue of climate change, that's something we've been doing, but the answer shouldn't be more burdens in a different style. That's just absurd.
Well, didn't she at least cite Burke once in one of her speeches? So I will say to her, she talks a good game on the continuity between our previous generations, the wisdom of our inherited forefathers, and the covenant to the unborn. And considering most of the politicians won't be around when the 2050 target comes to fruition, but we'll still be paying for it, and our kids will have to grow up, if at all we have children, considering the climate activists keep telling them to voluntarily depopulate to save the planet, they'll be the ones living under the iron curtain of immiseration for lowering carbon emissions. So, climate change emergency is increasingly an excuse for the state to confiscate our individual liberties, to clamp down on consumption, to crack down on all of the things like the Industrial Revolution brought us that made life more than bearable. Despite their objectionable obstructive activities, some are calling for climate protesters to not be prosecuted for all of the infrastructural devastation that they've caused because we're in an emergency. Extinction Rebellion this week actually smashed the windows at the News UK building. I'm just going to turn that off. Funnily enough, there was a statement from Steve Toos, who's a member of Extinction Rebellion and ironically a former Sun journalist. There's a bit of meme magic there for the latest segment. These newspapers have spent 30 life or death years denying or ignoring the climate crisis to ensure that business as usual keeps the money flowing into their already obscenely bloated bank accounts. I would like him to put down whatever climate nonsense he's reading, pick up a dictionary so he doesn't have to do run-on sentences, please. As a result, millions of us still have no clue about the terrifying dangers that threaten us. We can agree on that, Steve. You definitely have no clue. Unfortunately, despite the eloquence of this man, Good Morning Britain... Extinction Rebellion are actually protesting a fuel depot, despite a court injunction telling them not to. And they've threatened to sit in the M25 surrounding London. So if you were trying to circumvent the train strikes and even get away from the smell of your bins, because there are many bin strikes going on, you won't get anywhere very fast because they're impeding the working people of this country driving around in their cars. It's not like we have any concerns anyway. No, onward into the climate utopia. Good Morning Britain has proposed an amnesty on these protesters being prosecuted for their disruption. We won't play the video, it's just Ed Balls prattling on about why we should get rid of all of our standards because we're in an emergency scenario. I might humbly point out that if the rules can be broken in an emergency, then they're just going to engineer emergencies to break the rules. I don't think we should be dispensing of any objective moral norms just because a bunch of crazy-haired weirdos tell us to. How do you feel about that?
I can't say I disagree in the slightest.
Well, unfortunately, the next gentleman does. The danger frog-haired person speaking in this segment, with that just dreadful tie-dye shirt. His incredible quote was, he's a member of Just Stop Oil. He justified invading football pitches, damaging picture frames on Price's artwork, and blocking the oil refineries as about forcing the issue to the forefront of public consciousness. How wonderfully Marxist of you. However, when one decides to make aggression to make their point, they kind of lose the argument. Does make a good point, though, that Conservative Extinction Rebellion protests pressured the Conservatives into pushing a climate emergency declaration through Parliament. So when they stood on top of the trains and that, rather than the Conservatives saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this, they actually just went, yeah, you're right about the climate emergency, we should pass it through. I always return to this story. I spoke to Chris Pincher at the Conservative Party conference. Not Chris Pincher. That was a slip of the tongue. Didn't speak to him. I spoke to Chris Skidmore. Let's not get those two confused. I wasn't molested, I promise. And he was the guy who signed net zero into law. And when asked, how did you do it? He just said, I just changed the number. So no costing involved. Lovely. Speaking of people that are climate catastrophizing, Prince Harry decided to tell the UN about how climate change and disinformation on the internet are a global assault on democracy and freedom. He got his private jet to jet over to the UN from his California mansion and speak to, as photos that I didn't include show, a room full of basically no one, because nobody cares about what this ginger convert to globalism says. Pretty sad that the formerly bachelor prince has been having his balls placed in the purse by an American divorcee, but suppose we move on. Greenpeace agree with him, though. They say the climate emergency is a legacy of colonialism in this cracking new report released today. We're on the cutting edge of intellectual titanry here. The climate and ecological crimes are a legacy of systemic racism, and people of colour suffer disproportionately from their harms, a Greenpeace report says. I think there are plenty of hurricanes just pulling on their KKK hoods. Globally, the report says, it is people of colour who, despite having contributed to the least of climate emergencies, are now disproportionately losing their lives and livelihoods by the millions because of it. India's emissions would like a word. Produced in collaboration with the race equality think tank, the Runnymede Trust, your favourite. The report traces the roots of the environmental emergency to colonialism, slavery, and the plunder of resources from the global south. Greenpeace says it is making environmental justice a central pillar of its work. It actually introduces the Kimberly Crenshaw and Kendi Andrews expansive definition of racism here, as inferred from group inequalities, by saying, we argue that the outcomes of the environmental emergency cannot be understood without reference to the history of British and European colonialism. We were more successful, which set in motion a global model for radicalized resource extraction from people of color. It's the same old Leninist belief in colonialism being the unilateral extraction of resources from one country at the expense of their economic output. It's the labor theory of value, and it's just nonsense. The environmental emergency is the legacy of colonialism. This was because colonialism had established a model through which the air and lands of the global south have been used as places to dump the waste the global north does not want. Now, I'll give them a tiny bit of credos here, because we do have a lot of greenwashing in Parliament and governments around the world, because we do just sort of ship our waste over to a place like Ghana just to be burned on the coast, which just makes a lot of this very expensive performative green policy, which I have been trying to rectify in my prior career, just a form of immiserating us at the expense of the living conditions across the world. I don't know how you feel about conservation. I think it's a worthwhile goal for any Conservative, but do you feel that they actually have a genuine concern for that sort of thing in Parliament?
No, not really. I don't. I think they're just saying what they think they need to say in order to either get the funding or to get the votes.
Well, do you think there is a voter base among the Conservatives that actually bother voting for any of the net zero stuff? Because we keep hearing, oh, people voted for it. It was in their 10-point plan that was chiefly topped by Get Brexit Done, and nobody read the more of that. But do you think there is even any Conservatives willing to vote for this nonsense?
I think that Conservative voters or conservatively minded people, as you say, believe in conservation, but that is used as a way of hoodwinking them into voting for, essentially, as you say, pseudo-leftist nonsense.
Trojan horse?
Yeah.
Shock. So this scaremongering actually goes against all available evidence. Nowhere in the UN's IPCC report that the Extinction Rebellion have pretty much given up citing now because people have called them out on it, including Andrew Neil, who converted Zion Lights to not being an Extinction Rebellion protester, and now she goes out stumping for nuclear power. Nowhere in the IPCC report actually predicts an imminent collapse about as reliable as a Mayan calendar. Michael Schellenberger in Apocalypse Never, great little book there, if we can get rid of the Amazon cookie thing, documents how in early 2019, many of you may remember, newly elected 29-year-old Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the central brain of the Democratic Party, said the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. Now, we might be charitable and say Miss Cortez had a slip of the tongue, but considering she's a lying, insidious communist, I'm not going to be willing to grant her that ground. The next day, a reporter for the news website Axios called several climate scientists to get their reactions to AOC's claim. All the time-limited frames are BS, said Gavin Schmidt, a NASA climate scientist. Nothing special happens when the carbon budget runs out or we pass whatever temperature target you care about. Instead, the costs of emissions just steadily continue to rise. So, no impending catastrophe. That's from the NASA climate scientist. That's from the leading body that actually hosts the 97% figure on his website. Actually, I saw someone do a cost-benefit analysis of the IPCC and said, actually, if we hit all the IPCC targets and we just dispense of the economy, it'd only be a coin flip chance as to whether it actually did anything anyway.
Goodness.
So, if it was a impending catastrophe, we couldn't do anything. But luckily, it isn't. And instead, the policies are so bad that they're the more likely things to immiserate us. Then there's also the UN itself getting things wrong. The UN says natural disasters will increase 40% in a recent report. But Bjorn Lomborg, who does the Lord's work in actually costing these sorts of things, he's done a Twitter thread on how the UN has actually misrecorded the natural disasters, and it's mainly because they just forgot that we had satellite imaging and increases in seismometer improvements, so they're just recording stuff they didn't record before. And they also enveloped some natural disasters. They put some man-made stuff in there, like wildfires that were started by arson. They said it was just exacerbated by climate change. Normally it's actually exacerbated by climate policy. I don't know if you remember the Australian and the LA wildfires from lockdown in 2020.
Yeah.
And we obviously heard about the world is on fire. Actually, it's on fire because you didn't do any dieback burning. And in LA specifically, you imported a bunch of Australian eucalyptus. And if anyone knows anything about eucalyptus oil for like your throat and that, it's got loads of hydrocarbons in it. So it went up like a bonfire because you built it that way, you bloody idiots. So then heat deaths themselves, as we've been warned about constantly in the UK, is a little heat wave. They barely register as a concern. From Bjorn Lomborg's old book, call it. In Europe as a whole, about 200,000 people die from excess heat each year. However, about 1.5 million Europeans die annually from excess cold. That's more than 7 times the total number of heat deaths. Since 1998 to 2008, Europe lost about 15 million people to the cold, more than 400 times the annual heat deaths from the iconic heat deaths from 2003. That we so easily neglect these deaths and so easily embrace those caused by global warming tell us of a breakdown in our sense of proportion, reported by the media. Yes, what happens after 2050 when heat deaths are meant to be eventually outweighing avoided cold deaths? Because, of course, the planet's going to come to a cataclysmic end. Heat deaths actually won't outweigh cold deaths, not in 2050, not in 2100, or even 2200, according to the modelling. So, nothing to really worry about there. But don't let these inconvenient facts get in the way of the narrative. We have to push onwards to abolishing fossil fuels, as that colourful gentleman from Just Stop Oil said. Unfortunately, renewables aren't really up to scratch. As we can go to the next article, there's an issue of corrections in here where there's a lot of cope about misreporting, but they never actually walk back the headline, because apparently California, who are very keen on installing solar panels, have caused a massive pollution problem in their landfills. California has been a pioneer in pushing for rooftop solar power, building the largest solar market in the US. More than 20 years and 1.3 million rooftops later, the bill is coming due. Many are already winding up in landfills and contaminating groundwater with toxic heavy metals such as lead, selenium, and cadmium. Bear in mind, we get most of these heavy metals and battery capacity from China, about 80%. Although 80% of a typical photovoltaic panel is made up of extremely recyclable materials, disassembling them and recovering the glass, silver, and silicon in them is extremely difficult, so most people just send them straight to landfill. No wonder then, there's also the space problem, and this is going to be a real recycling problem when we see what China's doing with their solar panels, as we can see here. Just papering over the landscape.
Oh, wow.
So if you can imagine, as Roger Scruton once said, the beauty of the English countryside was private property rights across thousands of years, and it was a cultivated thing rather than just left to its devices. That's what's going to happen. It's going to look like the outskirts of Blade Runner 2049. Looking forward to that future.
Oh, very much so.
Well, you already live in Birmingham, so you don't get much scenery. Renewables are also polluting the planet. So solar panels produce 300 times more toxic waste than high-level nuclear waste, if we go to the next Forbes article. By 2035, write 3 economists, discarded panels would outweigh new units sold by 2.56 times. In turn, this would catapult the LCOE, levelized cost of energy, so that's basically how much energy costs to make over time, to 4 times the current projection. It costs 10 to 30 times more to recycle panels than to just send it to landfill. More than 720,000 tons worth of wind turbines as well will also end up in landfills over the next 20 years, and only 5% of electric vehicle batteries are currently recycled. So if we're all adopting electric because new petrol cars are being banned in this country and Canada and the like by 2030, then we're going to have a major scrappage problem. But it's a good thing renewables actually work, right? Well, no. So I actually did the modelling on this a little while ago. The government actually listened to one of the policies in this, and I got a letter from Greg Hands, who, I don't know if he's still the sitting energy minister, but he probably won't be in the next couple of months, saying that we're going to take on board your advice on building new nuclear power plants and stop China from paying it, and instead allow the energy companies to factor it into their overall costs over time. So hopefully that builds all these new plants we've got, because currently the 2030 target for, I believe it's Bradwell and Sizewell, China own a 22% stake and a 33% stake in our nuclear structure. And we're doing a joint nuclear venture with them for £500 million on our shores. So that's not a national security concern at all. Luckily, we can just invest in renewables, right? Well, no, unfortunately, if the UK alone tried going renewable, it would take the world's battery manufacturing capacity, again, made 80% by China, from 2022 to 2030 to stop, be entirely redirected to the UK. It would cost £3 trillion. That's adjusted for inflation. It might be even more than that now. And then it would only make 26.5% of the current consumer energy demands. Now, that's obviously not accounting for an increase in things like induction hobs in homes and electric cars to make everything more energy efficient and more renewable. So, yeah, terrible plan. Didn't stop Germany, though. Germany decided to go full-throatedly ahead with destroying all of their nuclear power plants after the Fukushima disaster. They decided to go fully renewable by 2022. They had resulting rolling brownouts where energy production and storage dipped below usage rates. These actually cost lives in some cases. You know, hospital generators went out. And so now they've not only fired up their coal plants, but they've also invested more in a Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline than they did in NATO. And congratulations, you've gone on and funded Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Germany's terrible energy renewable policy has actually enabled them to be held ransom by Putin. His fifth-generation warfare tactics in energy rationing have resulted in the next proposal. As of today, the UN are actually telling residents to turn your lights off. Brussels on Wednesday urged Europeans to switch off the lights and turn down their air conditioning this summer, just when they're saying the heatwave's going to kill us all, amid growing fears of a likely cut-off of Russian gas supplies to the continent. When you rely on your enemies for your most vital resources, don't be shocked when they hold them against you. So this road to energy immiseration isn't going to help anyone. Renewables aren't going to work. Deciding to lock down the climate lock down the economy for the climate isn't going to work either. So has anyone got any brighter ideas? Well, thank you to Mad Uncle Schwab pulling out the Mr. Burns solution. Firstly, he said he's asking China to get more involved with the WEF to fight climate change. He said giving more power to big polluter China will address climate change, promote industrial transformation and social equity in the tweet. That's just next job. There we go. Grinning Bond villain. And in the next one, we've got a video, actually. They've come up with an even more novel solution. Just block out the sun. So for our audio listeners, it says, MIT scientists say space bubbles could help reverse climate change by deflecting the sun's heat away from the Earth. Don't see anything could go wrong here. Scientists say cutting out just 1.8% of the sun's rays would fully reverse global warming. However, it would be several years before space bubbles can be put to use, making the task of decarbonising life on Earth no less urgent. Yes, be immiserated in the present. The bubbles would be manufactured in space by robots. They would then form a raft about the size of Brazil. Don't see any problem with this. That would be placed at the Lagrange point. That is, a point in space where the sun and Earth's gravity balance each other out. This would keep the raft in fixed position. This kind of large-scale physical solution to climate change is called geoengineering. You know, that thing Alex Jones warned us about. Such several ideas have been posed. From spraying aerosols into the upper atmosphere, chemtrails aren't real by the way, to churning up tiny bubbles on the ocean's surface. All with the aim of reflecting solar radiation back into space. How noble of you. However, the MIT scientists say Earth-based geoengineering solutions could be too risky, as they might have unintended consequences for the biosphere. Yes, like polluting it. And that space-based solutions could be safer. How is your country tackling climate change? Terribly, we're all poor. So, thanks to the WEF using Chinese Communist Party propaganda platform TikTok there to give us basically the reasons for blotting out the sun. So there's an article on the WEF website explaining exactly how this is going to work. The WEF propose floating a thin film layer of graphene-reinforced ionic liquids, Ian Crossland of Timcast will be happy, into the upper atmosphere of Earth to create a filter the size of Brazil which will reduce the amount of solar radiation hitting Earth. MIT's ironically named Sensible Science Lab say if we deflect 1.8% of incident radiation before it hits our planet, we could fully reverse today's global warming. It's interesting that suddenly the climate change narrative about things also getting colder and more extreme weather events like blizzards suddenly goes away when you want to reduce solar radiation. They propose a less likely alternative to spraying aerosols to geoengineer the atmosphere, because spraying aerosols would essentially counteract the greenhouse gas intensity by reflecting some of the solar radiation back. But of course, the atmosphere is a tragedy of the commons, so everyone's got to breathe it in. You can't exactly consent to breathing in geoengineered air, and which countries do it is actually a concern. But I'm sure the WEF themselves, being one giant super state, which we don't elect, will put it in safe hands. The public policy questions include whether geoengineering presents a moral hazard by undermining the support for climate mitigation policies and encouraging people to see the shift away from fossil fuels as less important. So note there, it's not a moral hazard because you as an individual can't escape geoengineering. It's the fact that it might stop governments from pursuing these immiserating policies in the first place. And again, it's very telling that when they say, oh, move away from fossil fuels rather than carbon capture the fossil fuels, they want to destroy your means of reliably generating energy rather than just get rid of the emissions, which would actually be a sensible plan, like pollutants. Translation, we're worried about people will think we're effing around with the atmosphere, so we've got to pretend that we aren't, even when we are. So call me a conspiracy theorist, but I don't really trust a bunch of lab coats to block out the sun without it having catastrophic effects. Like, I don't know, widespread photosynthesis rate decreases, mass famines, and another ice age. Nobel Prize-winning economist William Nordhaus once asserted that the economic damage done by the UN's incompetent climate policies would inflict more damage on the people living on the planet than if climate change just played out as predicted. So, it turns out that our policies may be far worse than anything. But of course, Nordhaus never counted on the fact that Klaus Schwab wanted to turn us all into the I Am Legend zombies to save the planet. If you'd like to know more about how Silicon Valley are actual vampires already, you can listen or read to my deep think on the website, exclusive to subscribers, because it seems that we'll all be going this way eventually.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the book club hangouts we do, this one on Beyond Good and Evil, in looking at Friedrich Nietzsche there, by Carl. And if you want to follow what else Carl's putting out, you can follow him on Getter at Carl Benjamin on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.